Hey everyone, thanks again for tuning in to the Ideation Podcast. This is Charles Lee, and today I have a very special guest. His name is Xavier Ramey. He is the Chief Executive Officer and lead strategist of Justice Inform, a social impact consulting firm based in Chicago. Now, I'm going to read his whole bio because I think you want to kind of hear all the areas that he's invested in. And those of you watching on video, you can watch his facial expression as I read the rest of his bio. He is an award-winning social strategist, noted public speaker, and conflict mediator, combining his background in economics, extensive management, and social impact experience, and direct action campaigning in the Black Lives Matter movement. Xavier leads a company that brings a wealth of experience and network to clients seeking catalyzed strategies for inclusion, philanthropy, CSR, and community engagement. He's a native to Chicago. He is a recognizable voice on the topics of community and economic development, policing and policy violence, and connecting the Christian faith to our lived experience. He's also served as a lead of the Social Innovation and Philanthropy Strategy at the University of Chicago's Office of Civic Engagement. He's managed large philanthropic portfolios to stimulate everything from employment, and worked as a nonprofit director of development in Chicago's North Lawndale community. Xavier is a founding member of the Let Us Breathe Collective, which I definitely want to talk about today, an artist activist organization committed to addressing state violence against people of color. He is a board member of Young Chicago Authors and the Chicago Center of Arts and Technology. You've done a lot, my friend.
And look, man, if it wasn't for good hydration, shea butter, and black don't crack, I would look like it.
I love this. So let's go back. Like, you have such an interesting journey that has kind of led you to what you do today. Tell me a little bit about your story. Like, all the way from your upbringing, all the way to what you've studied, and how, like, were there like key moments that pivoted you or shaped you into who you are today?
Yeah, I'll start professional because it's easy, and then I'll jump into the personal side development. Professionally, the last roughly, so I'll say since around 2006 or 7, I've been in the professional world. So working full time, doing my thing, all that. So about 14 years. And I've been, up until this point, working primarily with a goal of gathering information. I was looking to gather information about how I happened. How did the hood happen? How does injustice happen? And that's why when you were reading off sort of my resume, so to speak, I was like, yep, those are the big areas. Those are the big buckets that I had identified. So it starts with working on the ground and getting your heart tuned to people, understanding the actions and the goals that can take you away from wanting to do the right thing because you want to accumulate more things. And so, my first job as a development director, which is, for all those who don't know, that basically means like I was the head of fundraising for a nonprofit. It was the worst time to start that job because it was the beginning of the Great Recession. Terrible job to start in a recession, to be a fundraiser. But I learned very deeply how to connect to people. I learned also what they were choosing instead of us in the Black community, instead of us who were poor, instead of us who were, generationally divested and politically maligned. And I learned what they were choosing instead of us. And from that, I realized that I needed to go higher up because, of course, once you realize that there's contamination in the riverbed, it's probably coming from upstream. And so I went upstream to a higher level of economic distribution to become a program officer at a foundation to give away money. And there you learn how corporate interests often drive economic community outcomes, how their definitions of volunteering and giving back and all of that shape the limits, the boundaries, which people like me who were on the ground previously had to work within. And it was often people who were not only mentally and emotionally checked out and distant from our communities, but they were also financially and residentially segregated. They were of a different income bracket, and that income bracket also allowed them to live in a place where their physical bodies did not give them the day-to-day experiences to be proximate as well as responsible in their allocation of resources. But they also didn't trust us to do it. So they were always, asking, show me more impact. Show me data-driven. It's like, well, give me the data-driven impact of you and your kids.
Yeah.
This is life on life, man. It takes time, and everybody's different, and you don't win it all. We take that relational approach. From there, I realized that people were creating information. And the University of Chicago came into play at that point. Academics create the information that substantiates the validity of the strategies that these consulting firms produce, that cities and corporations and large nonprofits purchase to then deploy in low-income communities, Black communities, indigenous communities, et cetera. And so I went around the academics, and I worked in the Office of Civic Engagement, and I got this really cushy job, and it was really, really awesome. And I got to build projects and teach social justice to privileged students who were like, my mom never told me this. Like send them home for Christmas. And, go talk about all the stuff you learned. And they're like, Dad doesn't like it. It was great, man. It was just great. But it was also really dope to teach people a higher level of care, which is what I was proposing. I was proposing a higher level of care, a deeper level of relationship. To people before they started accumulating things. They're in school and they haven't yet gotten all the returns to their privilege. And so I was trying to dissuade them from hoarding it. And after that, I realized it was, when Trump got elected, man, I think everybody, on the other side of the aisle took a pause moment. 2016, I think in American history will be an inflection point when the history books are written about this time. And I was listening to what he was saying and Steve Bannon was saying and these other folks talking about turning everything around. I watched them rewrite the Justice Department's webpage, in a week. They erased all the work we had been doing around criminal justice reform. And they replaced it with a 10-point plan for law and order, which in the Black community, that just means you're about to flood our streets with police and guns. That's never meant safety, equitable wages. That's never meant any of that kind of stuff for us. When people start using terms like law and order, America, freedom. Right. That's, and so I wanted to get deeper into the game. So I started Justice Informed. I wanted to be able to take on the responsibility of my truth because, and anybody who's, working at a firm or working at a company or working at an organization, all of your work sits somewhere between the limits of the ambitions and the fears of your employer. Absolutely. What they're afraid of, you have to respect. What they want to do, you get paid to accomplish. So you're living within the ambitions and the fears of your employer. And as long as that's okay, stay employed there. I have a bit more of what I think many people would call a radical edge. I would call a relational edge. I propose solutions that folks think are extreme, ones that I think are finally effective as it relates to how quickly and how extensively we should reorganize our society and our homes and our communities to make them not only safe, but empowering for people who've always been on the margins. And so professionally, it's gotten me to this point where I'm confident enough, I was capable enough, I was networked enough, and I had enough credentials to launch a social impact consulting firm, which our goal is to change the face of expertise, because consultants sell knowledge, they sell ideas, which become strategies, which further narratives in the world. And that's a very important role. And I also wanted to create Justice Informed to create a better definition for social impact consulting, because the stuff I was seeing coming out of the big firms, where they were hiring a bunch of mostly white guys out of B school at Wharton or Harvard Business School or whatever, and they were studying case and all, and they would come to my neighborhood and I'd be like, go home, go back across, you're not going to live anywhere near the effect of the solutions that don't work that you're proposing, that you're charging $300 an hour for. You don't have to live with that. And so you'll never know. And please go back across town with that. And if you want to do this work, come over here and do it with us, among us, but don't do it at us. So Justice Informed was created, to be a social impact consulting firm, but it was also created to be a playground for ideas to establish a better model for what this should have been. So that's the professional journey. Personal stuff was all wrapped up in that. It was the catalyzing, my dad's a community organizer and entrepreneur. Mom was an artist and calligraphist and all of that. Dope mom. And she was an awesome mom. I love her. Still around. And she instilled in me a deep fervor for reading and learning and exploring and going into other cultures and traveling. Even though, we had $20 a week for food for the whole family of 6.
Yeah.
We still made it work.
Yeah. I think we met in Atlanta at an event. We were both speaking at that event. And what I appreciated was that not only were you kind of pushing people to consider things that, seem kind of, like you mentioned, like on the edge, but at the same time, you were really good at defining terms. And I feel like one of the challenges of the whole social impact space is like social impact means so many different things to so many different people, right?
Yep.
And so like, how have you navigated that? Because, when someone visits your website, they read, oh, social impact consulting, and I could only imagine where their head goes, right? Is it just like a constant education that you're doing for folks? Like, how did you come to even like call it that? And moving forward, like, how are you shaping the narrative of how even people are thinking about this?
Yeah. So, the first thing I do when I'm trying to educate is I listen deeply. I listen to know, what do you think this is?
Yeah.
When I say
that's good,
gender violence, what comes to mind?
Yeah.
When I say social, most people think media.
Yeah.
That was one of the biggest issues when I first launched Justice Informed. I was like, oh yeah, we do social strategies. And they were like, oh, can you help us with our SEO? And I'm like, what? No, all right, I gotta figure this out. We're not branding right.
Yeah.
Because obviously social 20 years ago didn't mean media.
Yeah.
And I had to upgrade and update. But yeah, people have their own definitions, and that's because they have their own unique experiences, and they often censor those experiences.
Yeah.
And so part of doing this type of work is meeting people in their choices, right? I always tell people we have to meet people in their choices. They resist, like we're seeing right now with like, wear a mask, and people are like, don't you ever tell me to wear a mask to protect my grandmother from death. Yeah. Right? Like, it's like, that's not a bad thing. Like, just put on a mask. Don't tell me.
Yeah. Yeah.
People have this, many people I find have an insistence on self-sovereignty. And I think that's an innate and a requisite part of being a human.
Yeah.
Demand to be able to chart our futures. The question is, with that, are we connected as we're doing our own charting of these waters?
Yeah.
Right? Are we caught in that Dr. King moment of that inescapable network of mutuality? Or are we just all independent actors out here not affecting or contributing or hurting anyone else based off of what we do? It depends on your worldview. So defining terms is incredibly important in order to do social impact work.
Right.
I can't do diversity, equity, inclusion work unless I know what you think diversity versus equity versus inclusion actually means.
Yeah.
And so most of the work is actually analysis and asking questions. And then we've got our own library of terms, which I've created based off of years and years of listening to people tell me what they think something means. Yeah. And then taking that and saying, well, a little bit of a definition is what Webster's dictionary says. A lot of what a word means is what you think it means.
Yep.
How you think it is, And so we combine that to create a more succinct humanistic approach to language. And then our goal is to replace people's definitions that don't allow or have the rigor of equity with ones that do.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think your approach to listen first to see what people think it means, I think is a great approach. I mean, when I think about even some of the debates we're having around freedom and choice and those kinds of conversations, some people may define freedom as freedom to do what I want to do, while others may say, hey, this is the freedom to do what we ought to do. And there's some type of moral, underlining behind their thinking for something that may be bigger than themselves. So, I've always appreciated your approach in kind of doing it this way. Well, let's dive in, because like you have, I visited your work and your website. I watched some interviews you had, and I love the 4 areas that you're focusing on. Is DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion, community engagement and strategic planning, public policy-informed corporate social responsibility, equity-focused philanthropy. So when I think about these areas, they become pretty intertwined. And in order for any organization or business, I think it's really important to kind of dive into some of these areas. So talk to me first about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Walk us through how you frame each of these words and what role it plays in the life of an organization.
Yeah, those were. So part of the challenge is like, those words came about because one, that's what the market calls it.
Yeah.
People call that type of work. I have my own definitions, but again, language is not only what you think, what I think it is, it's what you think it is too. And so I didn't want to fight you. And when you're doing equity work, you got to choose your fights. I didn't want to fight over language in that way. I just call it DEI. I think DEI is the shallowest way of explaining what that work actually is. But that's how you get your SEO up.
I guess you do have to start somewhere, right? Like,
you got to start somewhere. And so, I'd rather fight for DEI than for DEI as an action rather than DEI as a word. But it also came out of what I was already doing and what I knew how to do. I've been doing strategic reorganization of companies for years. I worked a lot in CSR, corporate social responsibility. I've had already been doing advising and consulting work in diversity, equity, inclusion. And I'd spent 8 years in philanthropy as either a fundraiser or as a fund manager. And so I said, well, these are the things that I can do, and it's my company. So let's do it. Like, that's the totally non-sexy reason why those things are up there. I think it's the first time I've said this publicly. That's totally why. Those are the 4 areas. But the question that was really important to me is, but what makes any of those things, which are standard things that are already out there in the world, what makes them informed by justice? What will we have to add to get them to be informed by justice? And that's why you see equity-focused philanthropy, not just philanthropy. That's why you see public policy-informed corporate social responsibility. Right. That's why within diversity, equity, inclusion, you see certain types of actions that are requisite to the service models that we use. And community engagement is really just a catch-all. For the work that nonprofits often enlist us to do. Many times it's around strategic planning with an equity lens. A lot of organizations right now, they've been doing who hasn't done strategic planning? Who hasn't said, who are we and what should we be doing over the next 5 years? People do that all the time. That doesn't mean they do that with a focus on centering the margins. That doesn't mean they reorganize their financial model around equitable wage practices, or that they reorganize their marketing strategy around language that provides dignity to those who otherwise you could just talk any type of way about, and everybody would get it and not know the inherent biases that are being pushed through their language. And so we add that lens to it, that equity-focused lens to it. I think you asked, like, what specifically do we do in DEI?
Yeah. Well, I mean, how do you, like, for your clients, when you say you're doing work in DEI, what do you mean by, like, diversity? I know, like, in, say, a corporate space, it used to be really about diversity, and then they added inclusion, and now more recently there's language of equity around it. And so is there a progression of thought there in your mind, or what's happening with those words? Do they build upon each other? How do they play with each other? Love to kind of pick your brain on that.
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum. There's levels of engagement, right? Yeah. Diversity, and more specifically, it's what at Justice Informed we call representative diversity. It's just butts and seats. We're looking for, we need to have a more diverse workforce. That has nothing to do with equity. That has to do with, we want things to look differently. Yeah. And what that's doing is that's centering the value of visible difference and assuming the permeability of difference, which often it doesn't, which is why inclusion is important, right? Just you bring a bunch of things that are all different into the same bowl. You call that a world, and that world can be at war.
Yeah.
right? That doesn't mean that the relationships are transferable and permeable and equitable. It just means that people are in the same room together. It doesn't mean that they're being listened to. It doesn't mean that they're sharing power. It doesn't mean that decision-making strategies or efforts are relegated to those. It also doesn't mean that there's been any acknowledgement of why people were not there, right? And that's one of the biggest challenges around inclusion, is that many companies look to go about doing it without any level of acknowledgement, not knowing that all DEI work is about relationships. And how do you establish a relationship without acknowledging why there never was one?
Right.
It's just impossible. You're going to create internal resentment because
Yeah.
you didn't think you were dealing with humans.
Right.
You thought you were dealing with labor units. And so the inclusion work was around voices. Usually when I hear people talk about and define inclusion, they're talking about the inclusion of voices. The assumption that they're making within that is that by being able to speak, you also have power.
Right.
That's simply not true.
Right.
We know that power moves through language, but power also moves through relationships. I can sit down and talk all I want in a room full of people that don't look like me, and I can be the lowest paid person in the room, but I had the right to talk. Inclusion. Inclusion.
Right.
I can go to HR and fight for a pay increase, but not have enough relational capital in the firm to get that passed, even if there's inequity found in the data around, my performance over time increasing and not being compensated for it.
Right.
I don't have the relational capital.
Right.
All of these things are still possible with inclusion.
Yeah.
Right? Harm is still possible. So equity came about, I think, because long-term, people that look like me, sound like me, ended up in these jobs. And we were like, okay, that last stuff y'all were doing, fantastic. It was good and insufficient. It was very good, but insufficient. And we need to ratchet this up. Behind that is this big question to anyone who has privilege and power, anyone who's an executive leader in a firm, or anyone who is of a privileged identity group in the country. You have to ask yourself this very, very tough question: how much does their voice matter versus my voice when it comes down to us deciding what we're going to do?
Yeah.
Does their voice matter than mine? Does their experience matter more than my confidence?
That's good.
You got to answer that question. You got to answer that question. You answer that question before you push them into an argument, before you berate them for, well, show me exactly where this messed up. Show me exactly where I was the one that did. Show me exactly, because that's the first thing that privileged people do. They demand discrete information, which none of it is usually organized or accumulated. It's the experience, the accumulated experience that creates oppression of these complex, interwoven things. And so equity is really about taking responsibility for what happens outside your firm that comes inside your firm, and what from within your firm was produced inequitably and that produces inequity because you rested on the opportunities that tradition presented you as a privileged person. Rested on those opportunities of inherited traditions, whether that be you built your business model. When you went to business school, you built the business model for your company and you didn't include a social cost page. You have a full-scale real estate company and you don't have to document any level of cost around how it pushes gentrification and drives out affordability. And you take no responsibility for that.
Right.
Though over the course of the 20 years your firm's been in business, you've effectively managed 30-40% of all of the new units that have been built in the most booming neighborhoods, and thousands and thousands and thousands of poor people and people of color have been displaced. And the government picks up the tab for that. You don't have to have a cost page for that to get your business plan approved, to get the VC folks to buy it. Like, you don't have to. So equity is taking responsibility for what you never had to do that produced the opportunities that you now have. But you inherited that from somewhere else that also didn't have that lens. Yeah. That's why in strategic planning, I said some organizations now are saying, we built this wrong. We built it wrong. Yeah. We built it wrong. Let's dial this back. Let's bring in a company like Justice Informed. Let's get somebody like X in the room to help us think through what's in our bylaws that doesn't allow us to understand our board governance and our recruitment strategy, which produces the non-diverse board that we have. Yeah. What's in our compensation models? What is in our employee policies? What's in these formative documents and structures of our institution that need to be reorganized so that we can actually be, an equitable company or organization.
Yeah, this is why I think I admire a lot of your work, is because, creating this type of systemic change comes with so many implicit barriers and biases and challenges, and because we don't know what we don't know, we can't see what we can't see. So what are some things you've learned in prodding or moving people along? Because I would assume this is not hey, we're going to spend the weekend together and figure out a strategic plan and we're going to go implement it for our company.
No. So right now I've been scaling back in Justice Informed because I'm working on a special project. That's just something I came up with. And the point is, when I started Justice Informed, the reason why I did it was partly because of what I saw happening in the United States. And I felt we needed a stronger definition, and we needed a different type of organization to hold ambitions rather than fears. That was the thinking behind the genesis.
That's good.
One of the challenges when you, for instance, for me, I said, well, I want to build a company that, hires people who have disabilities and people who are indigenous and people who are Black and brown and Asian. And I want to bring them, this will be the umbrella. This will be the umbrella. And I was all excited and all of that, diversity, I was just like my client. And you remember I said this in Atlanta, our pain is their classroom. When you're a marginalized person, privileged folks usually like to learn, and I know this sounds harsh, they learn through violence. They may not see it that way, but when you insist on going across town to get an epiphany, to wake up to the realities of class divisions, that's violent. That's a violent teacher.
Yeah.
You have to fly to Africa to get a certain vision, to realize they have so little, we have so much. That's violence.
Yeah.
When it takes Ahmaud Arbery being shot down in the street and hunted down by 2 white men in the truck, for you to realize that Black people don't feel safe running. So all the time you spend at REI and talking about camping and, going and traveling to Mount Kilimanjaro and all of that, we don't just step into those experiences without thinking about the color of our skin.
Yeah.
That, when you try to hire the people who've been bearing the burden of oppression and injustice, there is a psychological and emotional work that becomes yours as an employer. They're coming in with years of trauma. They are bringing that into the client room. And they are the most brilliant strategists you could possibly imagine, but they're hurting. And so your company then has to be one, and this is what many companies I believe they have to push towards. They have to not only be an education space for the tactics of their trade, but they also have to be, and be broad enough and deep enough, if they accept that this is the point of work, broad enough and deep enough to be a healing space where adults spend the majority of their working lives and their days at work.
Yeah.
Which changes the face of what leadership demands.
Yeah.
The reason why my voice, I try to talk with a certain softness about very hard things. I'm very deliberate about how I moderate my face, my eyes, everything. And that's because I'm asking, by nature of my profession, I'm asking people to change what they think their life is and what life means.
Yeah.
That's a really big ask. That's a really big ask.
Yeah.
Hey, I want you to change how you understand money and all the stuff you learned in economics school. I need you to just rip that on out. Replace it with this thing.
Yeah.
And hey, the conversations they always say never to have at work around, politics and religion and all of this stuff. I need you to have those because those people that are affected by it are now your workplace peer. That's a big ask. And so I've pulled back to start creating a training ground for people who've already had what I call their mirror moment. They've already looked in the mirror and realized that their talent got them in the rooms that their integrity won't allow them to stay. That the tactics, what they know won't allow them to acquire and engage what is coming in this diversified world. And so many were coming to me hurt, and so many were coming to me still as clients seeking services that I realized I need to stop and do what the universities aren't doing right now. There's no curriculum to teach what we do at Justice Informed. No curriculum. There's no major. Nothing. There's nothing out there to teach it. Yeah. We have to create that. And I know people are scrambling right now to create that. Like Deloitte's making it, McKinsey's doing like, everybody's their little, I'm going to sell this curriculum thing. But if the people from the hood made it, like myself, if the people living off of $20 a week for a family of 6 for food made it, if folks who've worked in institutional philanthropy and they also spent years asking for money made it, if the folks who marched for their freedom and their right to live and for their Black lives to matter made it, it would look different.
Sure.
And so we've paused to create that space, that playground of ideas for people who are ready to be the leaders in the face of what social impact consulting and work must look like in the future. But it's hard. I've learned that you have to proceed with so much grace.
Yeah.
Because people don't even know, they don't, not like people are out there like, I hate people and I hate the Blacks, I hate the Jews, I hate them. People aren't out here like that. That's not how it is. They're more like, I just never really analyzed my life in the level of criticality that you're asking for. And I didn't realize that by buying this, it supported that. By living here, it pushed that. By doing, I didn't connect that inescapable network of mutuality.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to not want those things anymore.
Yeah.
And so DEI work is about, helping people to learn how to want different things in life, as well as diversify your workforce. And all
Yeah. I mean, it's such deep work. I would assume that as you're working with clients and they kind of come to this realization and this kind of philosophical shifting in their worldview, that once they start imagining, because my head's already going, okay, these are all the implications of what this means for every single department, our culture, our community, and it just feels like, oh my gosh, this is going to be
a lot.
Yeah, I mean, the good news for you is I probably would want you around for the rest of our company's life.
I don't want to be. That's the thing.
I know that's the thing, right? So it is this, and then on top of that, you think about corporate social responsibility for companies anyway. You're saying like, hey, let's make sure it's a public policy informed type of CSR.
That's right.
Like CSR, like words like social impact can be many things. It could be just like, hey, we give some money away. We have CSR. We have Volunteers Day. It's CSR. And to some extent, it could fall under some of that. Some of the activities can fall under that umbrella, but it goes so much deeper. When you start thinking about your company and its impact on the communities that it exists in, that's a whole nother level of commitment to civic duty and civic engagement and standing up for things and supporting things, investing, developing deep relationships with community stakeholders. So, man, that's a lot to digest for any company or organization.
It's only a lot because we haven't practiced it.
Yeah.
Right. You can imagine, like, I mean, it's for instance, the buying and selling of land. Mm-hmm. In some cultures, that makes no sense. Mm-hmm. There are cultures on earth that could never imagine saying, oh, it's $50 a square foot. It's just not like the earth is everyone's.
Yeah.
How can I own some of it? Have to go labor over here just to purchase something that is everyone's right by breath. Mm. We come into that equation in America and Europe and all these other developed, and we're like, oh man, that's real weak. Like we could take all of that. Bring the military. like that's what we do. That's what we do. But that's also what we've inherited.
Yeah.
That is the colonial model for understanding land. And so commercial real estate is built on that. Because the war was effective and the genocide was too. And so now we can trade without any, hippies and, these worldly, flower people coming in talking about sharing. Mm. The reopening of the economy right now that we're talking about in America due to COVID-19. The reality is that the only reason why we need to rush to reopen the economy is because we insist on not sharing with each other. because we believe deeper than that, that it is the only way to get someone to do something is to incentivize them to do it for someone else. And in order to incentivize them, you have to pay them. That is a belief that the human spirit was made to only produce under duress. That's a worldview. Everyone doesn't have that worldview. There are very few people who have a big enough military and budget to fight back, to propose peace and sharing. Because usually when we talk about peace and sharing, we're talking about, they're like, that's communism, it's, but like the real is public health is now being maligned because we don't believe that humans are capable of sharing. We only believe that they're capable of buying. And it has profound effects.
Right.
Profound effects, right? Yeah. Like we'll sacrifice elders, economy. CSR, that part of it, I think is, I see your face, you're like, corporate social responsibility for decades has been primary. I think it's been created around three areas: marketing, right, to improve the visibility of companies in areas where they currently do not have saturation. So marketing is one. The other is government compliance. There are regulations. This is usually like larger sectors: banking, aerospace, oil, these types of industries. They do CSR like, we gave back 40,000 whatevers to this community. And it's like, behind that is some government regulation because they weren't doing that years ago and like polluted 18 communities. It's like with banking, right? Like a lot of banks, like they talk about lending to small businesses. That's government compliance. That's the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. That's a government that they then spun it and started a foundation. In the 80s and 90s, they spun it to become a social good, but it's really just satisfying regulation. And so that's another area. Then the final one is just team building and engagement. That's where you get the volunteer day. Like, we're going to go wake up all these nonprofit executive directors that we demand not to have too much money because all of it's got to go to the kids and not the people who work there as kids. We want to wake them up on a Saturday morning at 8 a.m. so we can go paint this fence again, get these pictures out there on Twitter, and that's CSR. And that's just not strong enough, man. That's not like my neighborhood never got better because of any of that stuff. And so public policy informed CSR says, well, what is the data showing us at a legal and political level? If unemployment in the white community is March, February, it was somewhere around 3.5% or so. But for African Americans, we know there's usually double or 2.5 times whatever is going on in the white community. In the Latinx community, we know it's usually 1 3/4 to 2 times the unemployment in the white community. Then the role of CSR should be to drive those numbers towards parity. Right. And start your strategy there. Start the strategy there by bringing in real data and saying, what do we have? What do we do for a business that can support this? And it might be employment. It might be education. It may not be education. It might be environmental justice. Whatever it is, just align your strategy around data that matters and then market that. Right? By working together, these 4 aerospace companies working together in a collective impact strategy, we were able to drive down carbon emissions from our plane fleet by 8% over the last 4 years, which aligns to the SDGs in this ways, which saves this much. You know what I mean? Like, it's very different from like, gave $40,000 in free vouchers to people who couldn't afford the vacations we gave them a flight to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I mean, when years ago, our company started to get, invited to these CSR groups that were forming within companies, and clearly off the bat, their thinking was in a different place. Some of the areas that you mentioned was some of their outcome goals. When you start thinking in terms of like, we're going to impact the numbers and the data that are going to come out of our community, that's a whole nother level of accountability. Right. And, and a lot of like, yeah, exactly. Like, so when you see like, you can tell like walking in, like who's on the CSR team, often even for like these huge, huge entities that have literally like 2 people working CSR or one person and some part-time people. And so, yeah. And, even marketing is like, I mean, I guess depending on the institution, whether they even have support in that area or do it for that purpose. So,
and they're gutted right now. I mean, I've been talking to DEI and CSR officers over the last couple of weeks. They are shook up right now.
Really?
Potential global recession. And I mean, because DEI as a field has only been entrenched for maybe the last 10 years. It was always a question and an option.
Yeah.
Prior to the end of the last Great Recession.
Yeah.
And now these officers are like, is my job secure? 2, is the budget for this secure? 3, is it still a priority here?
Right.
People get vicious.
Yeah.
When you pull away their options. Like the companies, it was something I've been talking about for years. How do you recession-proof your DEI strategy? How do you recession-proof? I was talking about this for years. Like, you're going to have to. And the value proposition because the value proposition that people have been running with, the business case for diversity, is not strong enough.
Yeah.
It's not strong enough to recession-proof your work.
Mm-hmm.
And now here we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I would love to see more people who have, community engagement experience, have worked in, civic engagement, has worked with foundations and other things that would take on these roles. Because often like these roles within companies, and this is just anecdotal, I've probably talked to a lot. And it's usually like lateral moves from totally unrelated departments.
From interesting people.
Yeah.
Not qualified people. Interested people.
Yeah.
That's exactly. That was why I was so frustrated when I started Justice Informed. Now I'm thinking about it, because I remember talking a lot about the non-specialists. Right, you go on these nonprofit boards of directors, and it's like a lot of the people who are working in CSR, DEI, and other things. It's like the give back moment.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to come off as if I'm demeaning or diminishing their work or their perspectives. But the reality is that they shouldn't be able to own the evaluation of impact, because they often don't have to live in the areas where the impact was not valuable. They should not be able to own the evaluation, which is, well, it's good work. It is good and insufficient.
Yeah.
Relative to your capacity, it is good and insufficient.
Yeah.
So thank you, and come higher.
Yeah.
It's these non-specialists on these. You can imagine. I mean, think about the model, right? Like, you have an organization that's committed to like affordable housing and homelessness in a city like Chicago. Who do you think is going to be on the board? It's going to be a bunch of folks working from banks and marketing firms. It's the corporate for-profit folks who never dealt in housing public policy. If you say CHA versus FHA, if you say, what was the role of the Homestead Act in land acquisition in the 1800s? They don't know this stuff.
Yeah.
They don't know this. They never studied this stuff. They never went to school for this stuff. They can't readily identify 5 people who are actually looking for housing. They don't look at right now the shelter in place orders that are happening in many states. They've also imposed moratoriums on evictions. Sheriff's offices right now are hiring up because they know that they're going to get 4 to 5x the number of evictions requested of their department once these moratoriums are lifted and shelter in place goes up, because all these people haven't been able to pay their rent, which means we're then going to get a flood of more police officers in poor communities, which then produces more. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
that's not where they're at. Yeah. And I wish that they would take a year, 2 years, 3 years to improve their skills and their worldview before taking on the responsibility of very important work.
Yeah.
I'm not going on the board of JP Morgan Chase anytime soon. Anytime soon. They'll be like, what's this guy with the social impact going on the board? Right? Yeah. But a guy from JP Morgan Chase can sit on the board of a housing organization.
Yeah. Yeah, so needed. And I'm with you. Like, I'm not saying people who are heading CSR efforts are bad people. I think they're
No,
willing,
they're some of the best people.
they have desire, but that ability and training and the background and getting some of that underneath their feet is going to take time. And it's hard because they're probably understaffed. They're, relegated to expectations that are based on a old world view of thinking about this. And so, yeah, I'm so glad hopefully you'll continue to pave a way to be able to help CSR leaders specifically get some more framing.
Humility is a form of care for us. I'm just saying, like, people say, I'm not gonna put myself in a position of leadership until I show a level of followership that approves the prerequisites to me sitting in such leadership. Right? Like, if you don't understand class segregation and residential segregation, but you're in charge of a CSR budget, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for the people who have to live with the effects of what you ideate.
Yeah.
Be humble enough to care for people enough to say, let me go learn, let me go understand, not just be interested and eager and the only one in the company that wanted to do it.
Yeah.
Let me be qualified.
Yeah.
For some of the most important problems in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think, I know we don't have too much time left, so I want to focus a little bit on your Let Us Breathe collective. I definitely do want to highlight that. So tell us about this. It's described as an artist activist organization. What is it? And what's kind of the story behind that?
So Let Us Breathe collective, and I'm not terribly active with Let Us Breathe anymore. Okay. I'm a huge supporter of them, but I was one of the 5 founding members of it. In 2014, when Michael Brown was killed, I had a month off. I was transitioning out of my job as a program officer and into my role at the University of Chicago, and I took a month off, and I was like, I'm going to go to California, and I'm going to rent a motorcycle, and I'm going to drive up the coast and do the things, and and I had already had a photography. I love photography, and my background's actually in creative writing. That's part of the reason why I talk like I talk and I write like I write. I was in slam poetry and all that stuff. So I was like, I've been working. I'm going to go take pictures, landscape pictures of the beautiful California coast. And I go out to California, and then Michael Brown gets killed. And my friends called me up, and, they were like, X, this is ridiculous. Are you upset? I'm upset. And I'm like, yes, I'm upset. And the big question is like, so what do we do about it? What are you going to do about it? We're in Chicago, I'm going into a fancy role at U of C. I ain't never protested. I've never marched. I've never organized any actions. I've never stood up in front of a police officer and said, you need to leave. Like, that's not, and I didn't even know that was coming.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that was what was coming in a month for me. But we decided we wanted to help. And so we found that, we made some calls out to the St. Louis area where Ferguson's at, and found out that people needed gas masks. The police were gassing people. And you remember those images?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So when we were asking, people were just like, we just need tear gas masks. And so we launched a fundraiser, and we raised about $8,000 or so, $10,000, I think. And have you ever bought a gas mask?
No.
I had never bought a gas mask. Like, this is what I'm saying, where it's like, you don't even know what you're doing. You just you gotta do something,
Where do you even buy it?
We didn't know.
Yeah.
We went on eBay, now known as Rakuten. And, but then also made some better calls and realized that, gas masks are expensive. So we made some more calls, said, what's a cheaper alternative? And they were like, well, guerrilla warfare, like, all you need is bandanas, acids, you need water, and you need mixing bottles. And so we learned a real guerrilla tactic for helping people out. And so we had a ton of that in a trunk of a car and drove it out to Ferguson and ended up on the ground there. And one of the scariest nights of my life. One of the scariest nights of my life. It was my birthday. It was August 19th, and we landed, and then August 20th was my birthday. And it was the day after that iconic photo of that young man picking up that tear gas canister and throwing it back at the police. Yeah. The next day we showed up, and that was the day after the largest number of arrests in Ferguson. And so the city is it was a mess.
Yeah.
And the police had just raided a church that morning that we were going to be dropping off all the supplies at, and they had taken all of the gas remediation equipment and water.
Wow.
And one, police aren't allowed to raid churches.
Yeah.
It's a very clear message. If all you're taking is tear gas remediation supplies and water on a day in Ferguson, it's like 98 degrees and humid.
Yeah.
You're sending a very clear message. And we marched that night with the people in Ferguson, and it changed my life, changed my politics. I realized that all my work in philanthropy did nothing to stop what I just saw when, dozens of, different police units from different jurisdictions, different states, different types of states. Some of them are cities, some of them are counties, some of them are state police. Like, they all came together to say, your life doesn't matter right now. You need to shut up all that talking. And it changed my politics. It changed what I thought America was. And it changed the way I looked at my work. And so we started the Let Us Breathe Collective. It was called Let Us Breathe because we were founded out of need for air.
Yeah.
And we started organizing campaigns in partnership with protesters out in Ferguson. We started centering their stories and bringing them back to Chicago. A lot of us were artists. I was a photographer. I did a lot of photography. So I did a lot of photography for that and sending visuals back to cities like Chicago to share the message. We started directly funding the protesters on the ground by raising money in a larger city like Chicago and then sending it out there. We would send caravans of supplies to keep them safe, keep them moving. We would try to help defend them when they were incarcerated. When we came to Chicago, we launched what then became the longest sit-in protest in Chicago history, where the police have operated a very large, what they call an inventory building in my old neighborhood of North Lawndale, which the UK press exposed as a torture facility, where 7,000 people have disappeared. Many of them from my neighborhood and the surrounding Black and Latino neighborhoods around it. Wow. And we sat out for about 50 days outside that police station in a tent city that we built to protest that. Imagining a world where safety was not determined by the visibility of a police officer, but it was determined by the depth of rigor in our accountable relationships to one another, to hold each other safely. It was an experiment and it was a challenge, but Let Us Breathe came out of that and started doing that type of work. Now it's transitioned to Black and Brown liberation activities. And so it's, again, imagining a world without these state sanctions, without police violence, and what does self-determination look like? What does building our own communities look like? Similar to like the Black Panthers, when they were, eventually their leader was assassinated for attempting to organize people around self-determination for Black folks. But they Let Us Breathe took up a type of that work again. And I think it's really dope. So that's what I was doing with Let Us Breathe. And it was a highlight and still is a lingering highlight of my life. And those folks I still shop at. I love those folks. I think more people should think about what it means to do social impact work that isn't just giving back, but instead focuses on not taking first, that isn't just volunteering, but focuses on where do we need to help people? Where do we need to resist violence? And what does that look like? That's what Let Us Breathe was. It wasn't about giving back. It wasn't about volunteering. It was about an active resistance to state violence. And that's a different look and a different type of work, which involved shutting down streets, which involved calling out police officers, which included suing police departments to eventually get a consent decree.
That's really important work. I love the creativity behind that too. And maybe we'll close with this one last question. That is, what do you hope for in our country right now? I mean, I know that's a big question, but where do you want to see glimmers of hope? Maybe, we won't be completely different in the next couple of years. But when you think about the work that you're investing in, what would you like to see?
At their core, I want people to just consider one another. That's the point of all the work that I do.
Yeah.
That's the point of Justice Informed. Will you consider someone that you didn't even know you weren't considering? who need your consideration. Underneath that is that question I asked earlier. When they define harm, will you let the definition stop at theirs? Or will you fight them to include your voice and lack of experience in the definition of what has happened here?
So good.
If people would simply let the voices and testimonies of those who have dealt with, carried, and experienced the burden of implicit and explicit injustice be the definition for harm, be the definition for solution. When they say this is what we need, let it stand. When they say this is what happened here, slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, mass incarceration, war on drugs affected us in this way, and that led to the challenges around your talent recruitment pipeline. Let that stand. Deal with your own emotions out of the scene. This is not to get emotional about. This is a historical fact that has had incredible human implications. Let their testimony stand. That's what I would hope for.
Yeah.
But I've never seen a generation of humans, much less Americans, do something so complex and so simple.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely a good word. Well, Xavier, thanks so much for everything that you do for so many organizations, foundations, people, communities. And keep up the great work. And thanks for spending a few minutes with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate the work you do, and I appreciate you spending this time. We only get so many breaths in life, and the big trick is we don't know how many we get. And so each one that we get is a blessing. And when you share it with someone else, it's a shared one. So thank you for blessing me with your time and for your work with Ideation.
Thank you.